Going to attempt to do a quick video showing valve clearance inspection on the CB500, basically the Honda 500 motor on my CB500X. If you do not have the service manual, I highly recommend you obtain one. It's got a lot of good information in here, and in particular, getting access to the valve cover is complicated. There's a lot of things that have to be taken out of the bike to get access to that point. What I wanted to show here is the measurement. So the exhaust valve spec is 0.27 plus minus 0.03 millimeters, and the intake valve 0.16 plus minus 0.03. That's what you need to measure with your feeler gauges and make sure it's basically within that range to meet spec. One thing I was not aware of when I took the valve cover off is the seal is supposed to be replaced. So I have to order one of those, and as part of the seal, if you look very closely, there are drops of sealant. So on one side of the valve cover or cylinder head cover, the guidebook says you need to apply some sealant to 8 locations before you put the head back on. And I need to look up and actually see what sealant exactly they recommend, but that is also in the manual. So as far as checking valve clearance, so the first thing you have to do after you get the head off, you also have to open up, there's a cover that goes here with an O-ring. You take that off. That gives you access to the crankshaft. And you use this bolt, which is I think 14 millimeter. You turn that clockwise only, because that's the engine rotation. You turn that to align the appropriate timing marks to set the timing locations. So for the intake valve checks, it's very hard to see, but there's a punch mark on the timing wheel, or basically the shaft that runs your overhead cams. There's a punch mark on that, and there's 2 marks called with IN and EX. So when you're checking the exhaust valves, the IN and the EX marks should line up with the top of the cylinder head. When you're checking the intake valves, there's a 180-degree rotation of the crankshafts, puts IN up, and there's a punch mark, which is very difficult to see, but there's a punch mark that should also be lined up with the cylinder head when you are checking the intake valves. This may be difficult to show, but basically towards the aft side of the bike, these are your intake valves. On the front side of the bike, those are your exhaust valves. So exhaust valves are close to the exhaust, intake towards the intake. So it makes sense, right? So I have the intake alignment marks lined up right now. I have right here a 0.15 millimeter feeler gauge. And basically, you slide the feeler gauge in between the top of the valve and the rocker arm. So you basically want to start with the max allowed distance, which is basically 0.16 plus 0.03. So you want to use a 0.19 if you have it, or you combine 2 to make that. I started off with 0.18, and actually the gap was smaller than 0.18, so it was good. And then I went down to 0.15. And sorry for the camera movement, I'm trying to do this with 2 hands here. And basically check each gap, and as long as you're within the spec, you're good. And on my bike I was. So this is the 16,000 mile check. The exhaust valves were all between like 0.15 and 0.18, which is within spec. Sorry, the intake valves were all within the spec. The exhaust valves, so my first valve was 0.25. The other 3 were 0.3, which is right on the edge of being too big, but the 0.31 would not fit, so I'm just not going to touch the things. It's within specs, so I'm going to leave it alone. And that's really all there is to it. The time-consuming part is actually getting everything out of the way to get access to the top of the head. As I mentioned before, that took me about 2.5 hours to actually get all the components out of here to access the head. But once the cover is off and you do the valve checks, the actual valve check step is very straightforward, very easy.